So the quadratic formula, you've done the quadratic formula before. You probably remember it, but forgot it. The formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Now, what's the purpose of the quadratic formula? The purpose of the quadratic formula is, let's say you had a problem like this. Your job is to find the zeros, so you would factor, and you get x equals 2 and x equals 1. But what if it was x squared minus 3x plus 1 equals 0? And you think about completing this square, but you see the 3 and that looks like a pain. You can use the quadratic formula and still figure out what the x's are. And by the way, you could still do this problem using the quadratic formula, but I bet you would agree that factoring is a lot easier than doing a big old formula. But the purpose of the quadratic formula, again, you could do it for every single problem, is to figure out what your zeros are. Figure out when you graph a parabola, what those x-intercepts are. Okay? So let's do this problem here. Solve using the quadratic formula. If I really want to, if on your test, it's just going to say solve, okay? I could actually factor this. Oops. And that's 2x and 3x. That gives me 5x. When I set it equal to 0, I get 2/3 and 1. So if I know how to factor, that problem is easier. But I'm going to show you how I can use the quadratic formula and get the same thing. So a equals 3, b equals negative 5, c equals 2. Why do I like to write that? For my own sanity. That way when I'm doing this formula, it's easier. So negative of negative 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2, all divided by 2 times a, which is 3. So first step is fill everything in. Now, next thing I would do is I would acknowledge this. You don't have to do it in the exact order that I would, but this is what I would do. And I would do this first because this is the most ugly. So I'm going to take care of all of that first. So it's really the square root. Negative 5 squared is 25. And when we're doing this, we're going to multiply all of those together. So 4 times 3 is 12, times 2 is 24, and the square root of 1, which is 1. So all of that, sorry, wrong color, turned into this. Now it's easier for me to rewrite it. Negative of negative 5 is positive 5, plus or minus 1 over 6. I split it. 5 plus 1 over 6, 5 minus 1 over 6. 5 plus 1 is 6, over 6 is 1. 5 minus 1 is 4 over 6 is 2/3. If you'll notice, that's what I got here. You want to solve it by factoring? Great. You want to solve it by the quadratic formula? Great. And some of you go, cool, I'll do everything by the quadratic formula. I'm telling you right now, no one's gotten an A or a B doing that because there's so many opportunities to make silly mistakes here. There's so many steps. Okay? So when I try and factor this one, well, automatically I wouldn't even try because there's a negative in front. Could I? Yes, I could try. But I'm going to do the quadratic formula. A equals negative 2, b equals 1, c equals negative 3. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay? So what am I going to do first? I'm going to take care of that. 1 squared is 1. And then I multiply all of that. Now, I don't know about you. What makes it difficult to me are the negatives. So pretend they're not even there. So 4 times 2 is 8, times 3 is 24. And now a negative and a negative make a positive, but that's a negative. 1 minus 24 is negative 23. Can I simplify that? Yes, I can. It's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 23. The square root of negative 1 is I, and 23 is prime. So it's I rad 23. Okay. Now I'm going to bring this down. Negative 1 plus or minus I rad 23 over negative 4. Okay? So the problem with this one that I don't like about it is I don't like negatives on the bottom. So if you give it to the top, that turns positive. If you give the positive on CHOP and change it to a negative, then take the negative, change it to a positive, I rad 23 over 4. X equals. That's all you can do because there's nothing else to simplify. Okay? Now, what does this mean? I just want you to get a visual. What this means is that if I was to graph, let me move this over, these two, my parabola would cross at 1. That's a bad example. Let me move it over. At 1 2/3, and then somewhere over here would be the vertex, so that's 2/3. So those would be my zeros. What this means is that if I tried to graph this, it's imaginary. So and because it's negative, it's going to be down. It's going to be right here, which means it does not cross the x-axis because it's imaginary. Okay? But then why do you have x equals? Well, it's to respect the shape. How do I know that the shape would have 1, 2? That answer shows it. Okay? Now that I think you understand it, I want to make sure that we're good to go. All right? So let's look here. Could I keep going? Because the 4 and the 6 simplify? I cannot because there's nothing over here that makes it simplified. So that would be my final answer. Trust me, there's a method to my madness. Let's try the next one. This is almost the same thing, but would it be the answer? No, because in this case, I could treat. 4, 12, 4, 3, there's my double. I don't want to keep going. So I would do 4 square root of 3 plus or minus negative 4 over 6. Then I look, all 3 of these divide by 2, so negative 2, 2, and 3. So my final answer would be negative 2 plus or minus 2 rad 3 over 3, x equals. Okay. Now let's look at this one. Same thing, tree, tree, tree. It's the same number, so we know it's going to be negative 3 plus or minus 4 rad 3 over 6. Why am I going over that one? Because here's a common mistake. You go, oh, I can divide this one by 3, and I can divide this one by 2. No. If they don't all divide by the same thing, you are done. Okay, that's the lesson. And then your homework is to do this page. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take this, do the zero product property, which means factor. This is the square root one, completing the square, and this is that whole formula we just learned. What should be true about all of our answers? They should be exactly the same. Now down here, you just solve it any way you want. So you want to do the quadratic formula? Great. You want to factor? Great. You want to do the square root? Great. You want to complete the square? Complete the square? Great. Some of them, there'll only be one option, and some of them you'll have multiple options. So you need to make that decision.